A quick warning, this episode includes cursing and stories of violence. Please take care while listening. This is the Pulitzer on the Road podcast, connecting Pulitzer Prize winners with audiences around the country. I'm your guide, Nicole Carroll. I'm a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board and a faculty member at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. Each spring, 23 Pulitzer Prizes are awarded for distinguished journalism, books, drama, and music. On this podcast, we talk with many of the winners and hear the stories behind their prize-winning work.
I'm Jonathan Eig. I'm a journalist and the author of several books, including King, A Life, that won the Pulitzer.
Back in 2017, the historian and journalist Jonathan Eig decided to write a biography of Martin Luther King Jr., even though multiple biographies of King already existed. He spent the next 6 years reading previously unreleased FBI memos and interviewing Justice Department officials and people who were close to King. The final product was a book that shed important new light on the man and on the extreme lengths the U.S. government went to thwart him. It also includes details of King's life that some readers found objectionable and a stain on King's legacy. Information about affairs, and in one instance, an FBI memo alleging that King had encouraged a rape that took place in his presence. When Jonathan's book, King, A Life, was published, he got a lot of praise. At the same time, he also got questioned about being a white man writing about some alarming aspects of King's life. Jonathan knew the risk he was taking when he embarked on the book. To him, it felt important to humanize the iconic American figure. Taking that risk helped earn Jonathan the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for Biography. And when we reached out to him to see if he'd like to be a guest on this podcast, we assumed he'd want to talk about his book and his process and the range of responses to his portrait of Dr. King. But he had a different idea.
You guys reached out to me and said, you're doing these Pulitzer podcasts, and I immediately thought of Yohance.
That Yohance is Yohance Lacour, a Chicago-based journalist and writer who, along with his team at the Invisible Institute, a nonprofit media outlet, won a Pulitzer Prize in 2024 for audio reporting for a podcast called Didn't See Nothin.
I'm Yohance Lacour. 25 years ago in Chicago, a little boy was beaten into a coma just for being black. Almost overnight, the news stories turned to racial reconciliation and forgiveness. This is a podcast about how that happened and how it changed my life. This is You Didn't See Nothin.
You Didn't See Nothin is about a brutal attack on a 13-year-old black boy named Lenard Clark. But it's also about so much more than that. It's about the anger Yohance felt at the time of the beating and how he channeled that anger into covering the story for a small black-owned newspaper called the South Street Journal. And it's about how Yohance's understanding of the story at the time differed so dramatically from the way it was being covered by pretty much everyone else. As Yohance saw it, and still sees it, powerful members of both the white and black communities in Chicago conspired to protect the white kids who beat Lenard Clark. And to do so, they pushed for racial reconciliation and unity, ultimately silencing angry members of the black community. Decades later, Yohance set out to understand why the media, and almost entirely white mainstream media, ignored that story. It turns out Jonathan Eig was part of that mainstream media. Like Yohance, Jonathan reported on the Lenard Clark beating, but for a popular outlet called Chicago Magazine.
I didn't know about Yohance. I didn't know about him in 1997 when we were both covering the story. I don't think our paths ever crossed. And I didn't know about his podcast until it won the Pulitzer, and I'm embarrassed that I never heard about it when it first came out, because it's great. And we had this incredible overlap that we were both covering this story in 1997.
As Jonathan listened to Yohance's podcast, he found himself in agreement with everything Yohance was saying about the push for racial reconciliation and the media's role in spreading that narrative.
The fact that he got to go back and revisit it and think about how he covered it and how the rest of the world covered it and what we got right and what we got wrong really excited me, because I think about that kind of stuff all the time. I think about the stories that I covered as a journalist that I wish I could go back and do again. And it's usually painful to go back and read my old work because it's not good enough. It's not as good as I want it to be. But that's okay, because, that's how you learn to be a better journalist, I guess. So I just thought that it would be really cool for Yohance and me to sort of chop it up and to see what we remembered and to maybe figure out why I did such a bad job covering it the first time around.
And Yohance wanted to talk to Jonathan, too. So on a windy fall day in Chicago, naturally, the two journalists met up for a conversation.
I'm Yohance Lacour, and really proud and honored to have won a Pulitzer Prize with my team, with my audio team at the Invisible Institute. And I got a call from the Pulitzer folks, and they invited me to have a sit-down with Jonathan Eig here, man, who's also from Chicago, a writer, and an amazing piece of literature on Martin Luther King, for which he also received a Pulitzer. So here I am, a Pulitzer Prize winner, sitting with another Pulitzer Prize winner talking shop.
I don't think there's two other Pulitzer Prize winners sitting down together in Chicago today.
No, I don't
That's
think
cool.
so.
And the reason we're really here is because I covered that story too back in 1997. I covered Lenard Clark's story, and when I heard about your podcast, it brought back all kinds of memories.
Sitting at a picnic table in Armour Square Park, Jonathan and Yohance talked about what it means to revisit old stories in order to offer new perspectives, about the importance of collaboration, and the role journalism can still play in helping America face and heal from its wrongdoings.
We're looking this way, and there used to be a long row and line of Chicago housing, longest stretch of public housing in the country once stood right here. And among that was Stateway Gardens, which was a high-rise complex that Lenard Clark, who was 13 at the time, lived in. And he winds up in this neighborhood, which is across the tracks that are also behind us. The tracks in the Dan Ryan, and the Dan Ryan was actually constructed so as to separate this neighborhood from Stateway, to keep black folks, and especially poor black folks, out of this very racist Irish and Italian neighborhood that was also home to, two of our longest standing mayors, Mayor Daley and his son, Mayor Daley. And so when Lenard left his house that day with his bicycle, he had a flat tire, and he wanted to get air for his bicycle tire. And the air was free in Bridgeport, but the air cost $0.25 in the projects. So he risked his life to come get some air for his tire. And he's with another kid. He's with a few kids, but he's with one black kid that he left the projects with, and 2 or 3 Latino kids that had gathered with him to play some football. And right on this street right here, or nearby, he is spotted by a group of young Italian boys while they're driving by, and they decide they're gonna attack him simply because he's black. And they all got chased, but Lenard didn't get away. And right alongside this pub right here on the corner is where they caught him, and they stomped him damn near to death. And so the next day, my best friend called me and told me about it. And I'm 23 years old. I'm a self-proclaimed revolutionary, and I've got a foot in the streets and a foot in college, and I'm very familiar with, unfortunately, with violence. Just coming up in Chicago in an era that's, marked by gang culture and white supremacy, obviously. I wanted to do something. So I decided to write about it because I fashioned myself as a writer, among other things. So obviously you got Lenard Clark, who was the victim of this horrible hate crime. Then you got Frank Caruso Jr., who led the gang of what I suspect was 6 or more Italian young men who beat Lenard Clark, at least chased and helped beat Lenard Clark damn near to death. He was the son of Frank Caruso Sr., who was a Chicago Italian mafia member with ties that literally go back to Al Capone. You got Herbert Martin, who was a black minister with a pretty powerful voice in this area, who was already kind of in bed with the Carusos in the city. And, the Carusos basically bought him, and in exchange for that silver, he started to quell stuff. And then he wasn't alone. Black folks were extremely pissed off and riled up when that thing happened. And there was several other black men, mostly black men, who were paid off in one way or another to kind of silence their constituents and redirect the framing of this story to racial reconciliation and let's just all get along and this kumbaya story. And then you got Bridgeport, you got this neighborhood and its residents who, like, when this boy was attacked right at this bar I'm pointing at, 150 feet away, Bridgeport residents came out of that bar to protect these young men who had just left this little black boy for dead. And so it's a big story that spans, we telling the story looking 25 years back. So I think those are the main players.
What I love is that you got a do-over. Like, you got to look back on it with some perspective as someone who's older, who's lived longer, and also with, historical perspective. What was going on in the world when Lenard Clark got beat up? Why were we so focused on racial reconciliation instead of punishing the people who did the crime? And what can I learn from that as somebody who's still trying to figure out how to tell stories?
Yeah. So first of all, I didn't go for racial reconciliation, right? But in terms of the collective, in terms of media as a whole in Chicago, it was way too heavily influenced by, the plots and plans of the Caruso family. The racial reconciliation thing was first voiced by Herbert Martin, who was basically a loudspeaker for the effort to free or, save, rescue the lead attacker, Lil Frankie Caruso Jr., from prosecution in prison.
Right. One of the questions that made me think about when you were talking just now is we don't talk that much about the money piece of it. And obviously money motivated a lot of people. Caruso's handing out money influenced a lot of people, made them willing to go along. And that feeds the racial reconciliation line. So without the money, do we get this racial reconciliation theme? Are people being motivated in part by greed to support this narrative, which is obviously helpful to the Caruso family in trying to reduce his prison sentence?
Oh, yeah. I think they're motivated wholly by greed. Because it was when the money started getting passed out that the narrative changed.
Yeah.
You didn't hear racial reconciliation until people started
receiving checks. And then the media falls
for
it, unaware or overlooking the fact that this line is being fed by money.
Where did you first discover the idea of racial reconciliation, if you remember, around that case? And why do you think it was so easy for you to follow that thread?
That's a good question. First of all, I'm not a child at this point. I'm 31 years old, maybe. I've been around. I've been a reporter for 10 years. And yet I still felt like I was naive. I was focused on getting a scoop, on getting a story into the newspaper that other people didn't have. And I was thinking about the fact that I could get an interview with Lenard's mom, and I got into the hospital in the rehab center where he was in rehab. I was the only reporter who got there. I was focused on scoops, on getting information, and I wasn't thinking. And I think this is a typical mistake that I made as a young reporter. And I don't know how you tell a young reporter to learn to think harder, right? Because maybe I just wasn't smart enough or experienced enough yet. But I feel like I was just very often repeating what people said to me. And that allows you to be played because you're not thinking, why are they telling me this? And if I could go back and tell my younger reporter self, that'd be the question. I'd say, you got to stop and think, why is Reverend Martin telling you this? Why is he helping you write this story? Why is he feeding you this information? And I'm not stopping to think about what it means. And for a white person writing about black issues, you got to stop and think even more. And you got to think about what you don't know. Where are my blind spots? I have some huge ones. And I think what I wish I had done is, I don't think we met when we were reporting on Lenard in 97. I don't even think I knew about the South Street Journal, which is, again, another blind spot, right? I'm new in town. I'm living on the north side, not the south side. Maybe I would have come across the paper. Maybe I would have seen your story and I would have reached out and said, hey, tell me what you're seeing in your reporting. But often back then I was competitive and I didn't reach out and ask for help.
Yeah, I get it.
I think my intentions are really good. I recognize that there's something important going on here.
Yeah.
At the time, I was pretty proud of it. At the time, I thought I did a good job. I got Lenard mom to talk to me, and I got some time with them in the hospital. I saw some things that like none of the other reporters did. That's how I'm thinking about it. I'm not thinking about what's the big cultural impact here. How's this story going to help Frankie Caruso rehabilitate his image? I don't think that ever crossed my mind.
Look, if I were on another planet and I read your article and I only know about, these circumstances, what I can get from articles like yours, I see this really beautiful, kind of almost lovely picture of redemption of a young man who made a mistake and kind of admitted, acknowledged it, was forgiven by his victim, and it's some real, like, kumbaya does feel good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I can understand where you'd be proud of it. We were both, and I'll say all, victims of ugly system, man, and it was where white supremacy and media meet. That narrative and the folks pushing it, we're trying to make sure people like you pushed it, and it was gonna be easy for y'all to push that, right? And it was trying to make sure that people like me were silenced and weren't heard. The mayor's office called me back then after I was making noise, right? I hadn't made enough noise for it to reach you and even most of the public here in Chicago, even most of the black Chicago. You know what I mean? Because that's a small paper with little reach, but the people who cared, which were the dailies in Bridgeport and the police, you know what I mean, who are playing cleanup, they knew what I was saying, and they reached out to me and offered me a job, and they called me with some bullshit like, yeah, we've discovered that, you're a guy with deep ties to the community, and, we want to bring you in. I could smell that a mile away. You know what I mean? I'm like, and looking back, I wish I would have said, yeah, and been strategic and been a spook sitting by the door. But instead, I was like, nah, fuck you. I know what you're doing. You can't buy me. I wish I would have stayed the course. That's if I had to do all over again, that's what I would tell my younger self. Like, this is the nature of the fight, son.
You feel like you failed at that time?
I felt like I gave up. I felt like the system of media and power and wealth and gangsterism in Chicago was too big for journalism to make a dent. And so I'm like, okay, you know what? This shit don't work. I'll go back to the streets. I'll give me some money. I'll figure out how to organize out. I started to kind of develop that attitude that a lot of folks have now. I didn't stop voting, and I didn't but that kind of attitude, like, the system don't work. Just, it's all about taking care of yourself. It's a lot of us in my community who are like, fuck the system. Either way, we got to take care of our own. But again, it's both of them. You got to work with the system, and you got to work in your own communities. And I wish that I wouldn't have given up on journalism. That's what I would have done. That's what I would have done different.
Well, you didn't give up. You came back and did the story, 30 years later.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
While Jonathan proposed the idea to talk to Yohance for this episode, Yohance had just as many questions for Jonathan. He wanted to talk about Jonathan's research and writing processes, about what it means to portray a much more complicated version of King than the one the public tends to know, and how to keep King's values and teachings alive when the arc of history doesn't always feel like it's bending toward justice.
I wonder if the same way you were like, well, why wasn't I questioning why Herbert Martin was feeding me this shit? Why wasn't I questioning their angles? As you started to build with black scholars and experts and even associates of King with your book, did you ever feel the need to question any of them and their motives? How did that work?
Yeah, I think I've gotten better about that. Just looking around, wondering, why is this person helping me? What message do they want to get out into the world? And I think for the most part, again, there still could be things I'm missing, but I think people felt like the main motivation was that King's been watered down. I heard a lot of anger, and there was a lot of frustration that America has turned him into this very safe figure, and I was being encouraged to challenge that. And I don't know if they would have preferred a black writer take on the job, but I got the impression that they were just happy that somebody was willing to look at the question of why we have allowed the national holiday and the monument and all the kindergarten lessons about I Have a Dream to turn King into a safe figure. Harry Belafonte said to me, "We only like dead radicals in this country." I heard that same message from a lot of the scholars, too, that they were angry at the way King's image had been co-opted, in part by the white media and by the government. The main message, I think, that I was getting from a lot of those scholars is that, we need to challenge that.
So being, who I am, King and his legacy, is super sensitive to me. I wanted to go into the book with as open a mind as possible. But we don't have many heroes, black folks that is. And the general practice of America has been to paint horrible pictures of us as individuals and, and inaccurate pictures like you described of our heroes. I know that I have my own kind of personal issues that I'm grappling with when it comes to a certain aspect of humanizing them. So for instance, his flaws, right? I'm really curious as to how you balance defanging him, if you will, and letting people know that he wasn't just a soft, peaceful dreamer, with also revealing things that humanize him in a way as to show just how flawed he could have been.
Yeah.
When I did this piece on Lenard Clark, and we found stuff that no one had heard before, found out, it was exciting. Because as a journalist, as a reporter, it's exciting to bring new information. So I wonder, how do you compare the excitement in discovering allegations of like horrible sexual abuses to discovering, and if you would even build on some of what you discovered, you would say defanged him and made him a more radical figure than the one we were already accustomed to.
So just for people who don't know, who haven't read the book yet, the FBI was listening to King's phone calls and bugging his hotel rooms, right? And he was flawed, and not just with his sex life, but the fact that he, had mental health issues. I was really nervous about putting in his flaws and writing about that, and I was concerned that people wouldn't want to read about their hero's flaws, especially coming from a white guy. I have huge respect, but I felt like it was important to be honest, too, and the balance was everything. Like, I did not want to sensationalize it, but I wanted to be honest. And I felt like if I wanted the readers to trust me, that I had to be honest. I just felt like if I want you to really understand how this man suffered and how much he sacrificed, you got to know how he was feeling. You got to know what kind of pressure he was under. You got to know the fact also that this is what the FBI was using to try to destroy him. So how are you going to explain the ultimate power play with our government trying to take this man out and using his sex life to do it? And you got to really be careful of anything that's in a memo.
Yeah. When I read that piece about Martin in this hotel room, egging on rapists, I didn't believe it, especially when it comes with, this is something that won't be released till 2027.
And in this case, it's not even a typed memo. It's a handwritten note in the margin of a memo that says King is listening as a woman is being raped. He's watching this, and he's encouraging it and laughing. That's all we have. We don't even know whose handwriting it is. So you've got to be extra skeptical, cynical about that.
You revealed that, all of these FBI folks were like, drinking buddies with Southern segregationists and racists. And I'm sitting there wrestling with it and even feeling something internally about distrusting this information. And I'm like, I have no reason to feel guilt for distrusting the FBI. I have no reason to feel some weird way about imagining that, you're waiting till 2027 so you can AI it perfectly. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Because I know what the FBI has been capable and done. So I wonder how you receive information like that. When you heard that or you read what you read, how much credit do you give FBI transcripts as you put them in your work?
I spend a lot of time thinking about that, and a lot of time in the book addressing the issue of the FBI, what we know about their motives, how much we should distrust them. The answer is we should just trust them a lot. And that particular incident about the alleged incitement of rape is the hardest single passage that I had to deal with in the book. I thought about it, and I consulted friends about it. I consulted other historians about it, because I could have gone either way, and I was going back and forth. For a while, I thought it just doesn't belong in the book at all. And then I thought, no, it needs to be addressed, because it's out there in the world. Other people have written about this already. The New York Times had op-eds about it. People are going to wonder why I'm not even including it. But then finally, what really, and I was still going back and forth, but what really finally got me was that I decided to do some more reporting on it. But when we have an FBI memo that is not a transcript of a conversation, that's an agent writing in large part to pass along information, but also in large part to please his boss, J. Edgar Hoover. So you've got to take extra bullshit detector, turn it up to high. So why did I decide to include it in the book? Because I interviewed some Justice Department officials who listened to those tapes, and they said that they did not hear anything that sounded like a rape. So I wanted to put it in so that I could knock it down and say, we're not going to know for sure till 27, but we should not believe what you've heard, what you've read in the New York Times and in these other articles without further confirmation. So I thought it was important to put that context in so that readers would know that it's out there. You've heard that King was in the room during this alleged sexual assault, but don't believe it until we get more proof.
Given everything you just shared about the FBI and surveillance and their motives, what do you think that means for us moving forward, for black folks, for folks, pushing for freedom and pushing for the dismantling of white supremacy, be they black, white, or other? What do you take from that?
Well, one of the big takeaways for me working on this book is that I came away with a much deeper understanding and appreciation of why black people don't trust law. Like, look at what they did to King. And the interesting thing to me was that King obviously knew he was being surveilled, but King continued to feel like the government was the only thing that could really help change America. Like, he really believed that the only way to help enough people to end some of the practices, end some of the systemic racism, and really work on it, fighting poverty and improving schools was through the federal government. So he believes in the same force that is blatantly trying to undermine his work, encouraging him to commit suicide, plotting to replace him with a hand-picked successor. So where does that leave us today? Like, do we still believe that the government can be a force for good, or do we give up and just fight the system without, I don't know, like, that's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. Obviously it was the potential of government that he believed in.
Yeah, but King saw the Supreme Court end segregated busing in Montgomery. He saw the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act get passed because of the work he did and his partnership with LBJ, the same guy who's, dishing dirt behind his back. So it wasn't just potential for him.
Oh, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So yeah, I think that's proof that we can't give up.
Yeah.
And I also, man, thank you for sharing your newfound, I'll say, discovery of how deep black mistrust of government and law goes. There are a lot of us, when we are as distrustful of American government and law enforcement as you understand now, we deal with the idea that we are conspiracy theorists. And I think it's way more nuanced than that, 'cause that's a lot different than saying, the earth is flat. And so I wonder what you make of that conspiracy theory label when it comes to black folks who distrust American government and law enforcement. And I feel like we need more folks that white people can hear and trust to tell them exactly what you're saying, so as to, and certain black folks who are removed, and detached from what's going on the ground, to kind of start to sway that opinion and start to open up to the idea that maybe there is something going on here.
Well, a lot of people ask me, why I don't spend a lot of time in the book on the conspiracy theories around King's assassination. And in part, it's because simple answer is that I wanted people to cry at the end of the book, and I didn't want them to have to deal with another 100 pages of conspiracy theories. But the bigger point is that is it a conspiracy when the government was trying to get him killed? Whether or not they hired somebody or arranged for James Earl Ray or someone else to pull the trigger, they intentionally created the conditions in which some racist white man would think that it was a good idea, that he was doing his patriotic duty to assassinate Martin Luther King. There's no question the FBI did that. That's not my opinion, that's a fact. They put out memos saying that we got to get rid of this guy. And we have to make sure that everybody in America sees him as a threat. And our government, the same government that celebrates him with a national holiday, did that. So I'm never going to be able to prove whether there was an actual conspiracy behind the assassination, but I think that's less important than the point that we created a white supremacist structure and law enforcement apparatus that saw King as a threat and wanted him gone.
Yeah. Why do you think so many people need a smoking gun to hold these type of forces as responsible for them as they should?
Maybe we want the smoking gun because we can't have the smoking gun and it makes us feel better about ourselves. Like, oh, our government didn't do that. Our government wouldn't assassinate a moral leader, a preacher, a good man, a man of God. Well, our government did that. You don't have to have a smoking gun to believe that our racist policies killed Dr. King.
No, I appreciate that, man. Another question I had, do you believe in God, or are you a Christian?
I'm Jewish, but I believe in God. Yeah.
Okay, because his relationship with God, his spiritual relationship, which is more unique than, any person's blackness or whiteness, right, was clearly like a huge factor in how he moved. And so, I'm reading so much of it, and it's resonating with me because I lean on my relationship, my spiritual relationship, for much of how I move, and it made me wonder, how well do you identify with all of this story being a white man? How much do you consider the difference? What do you do about what you're considering? I started to wonder the same things about spirituality.
Yeah, I was really moved by King's spirituality. I mean, it changed me, really, to see how deeply he believed and to see how his actions were rooted in his faith. And I'm coming at this as someone who believes in God, but I'm also coming at it from the Jewish perspective, so I don't have any personal experience with the Christian church, certainly not with the Black Baptist church. So I'm trying to learn that, and mostly, though, I'm just trying to convey that it's just crystal clear to me that this is at the core of everything he does. And I feel like it's a huge part of the book, and whether I got it right or whether I had my own blind spots again that kept me from missing some of the nuance, but I had a lot of help on that department because I knew that I was weak, especially weak on the area of religion, and I had a lot of people reading it for me and giving me feedback and coaching me through that. And I did more for this book than I've ever done in terms of having backup, having readers, really go at it hard with me and try to teach me what I was missing.
Yeah. What do you think about his call for reparations, man, and what that and the relevance of that today? Because that hit me.
He was a preacher, right? And he was always saying that his activism grew from his ministry. And what he's saying, and this is true for my faith as well as the Christian faith, like, you have to atone for your sins before you can move on. You cannot ask for an apology until you show your sorrow, until you change your behavior, and until you atone for your sins. That's reparations. So when King talks about that, and he talked about it over and over, he's not thinking about it just in terms of practical matters. He's not just thinking about it in terms of money. He's thinking about, how do we heal our souls? How do we heal the soul of the nation? How do we heal the souls of the world? You have to start by making true atonement. And that's what reparations means. He said, don't tell me that we can't put a dollar value on it. Don't tell me we can't put a price on it. Lawyers and juries do that all the time. You slip and fall in a grocery store, we're going to put a dollar value on your pain and suffering. So it doesn't mean that it accurately captures every penny of how much you suffered, but we do our best. We take a shot at it, we put a number on it, and we move on. And we know that justice has been done. So we can do that for slavery too. We can do that for Jim Crow. We can do that for everything. And King talked about it all the time.
Yeah. So there's an amazing woman, Robin Ruth Simmons, out of Evanston, who got some of the first reparations legislation in America passed right up here in Evanston.
Yeah.
You know her? You familiar?
Yeah.
Amazing, right? And she has told me that a lot of the battle is getting, kind of like moderate white folks to understand that this will actually be a benefit to you, and not like, we're not taking nothing from you. We're not going to make your life harder. Truth be told, this all makes for a better life for us all. Why can't white people see that, and how do you think we make them see it?
I think there's so much resentment. Look at all the resentment around social services, that like it's a handout. It's not a handout. It's being good neighbors. It's caring about each other, right? But it's become racialized and it's become politicized, and you see politicians using this stuff, both sides, Republican and Democrat, using this stuff to appeal to voters, saying we're not going to help those poor immigrants. Affirmative action is wrong, right? And they even invoked Dr. King to say he'd be opposed to affirmative action because he said, we should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. And that's just, it's a lie, and it's a misuse. It's an abuse of King's legacy. We got to change the narrative, and I think it's a win for everybody if we start thinking about the common good and not just us versus them.
Yeah. And I think this is why it's important to return to stories, because quite often we'll discover that they've either been told inaccurately, something's been omitted, and lastly, or finally, for me, we grow as a culture and as a nation, as a society, and as people, and our thoughts on things evolve, so it's important to keep things in proper context, right? And if we don't, with the flow of so much information in the world, good information, bad information, otherwise, it's easy to forget.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I think that it's one of the problems we have in this country, the way we teach history, is that we don't think of it as being something that needs to be updated all the time. We teach history like it's a bunch of dates and names that you have to memorize, but it's changing, and it changes all the time based on who we are and where we are as a country. So, you look at all the great documentaries that were made about OJ, or you look at how the 70s are now far enough behind us that we can put in some of that stuff in context. Look at what Watergate meant to our country and the distrust of government. Let's look at that again now. And I think that's a big part of what we do is, in journalists, sometimes we get to do the first draft and that's it, and maybe we don't do a very good job of it. But we can try and do a second draft too, which is what made your podcast so terrific, is that it really wasn't told right by guys like me covering it. So let's look at it again, and let's see what we got wrong, and also look at it from where we are today. And same thing for Martin Luther King. It had been years since the last biography. He looks different now. Let's do it again. And there'll be another, King biography, whenever, 20 years from now too, because he'll look different then. And part of what we can do is, with these stories, is put them out in the world and inspire others. Sometimes they're going to come along because they're mad that I didn't do it right and they want to do it better. Great.
That's brilliant. And the only thing I would like to see change is that the woman or the man who picks up your story or my story and decides to retell it because they're mad we didn't, don't be mad at us.
Yeah.
Just build. Let's get in together. There's been too much conversation about daily journalism versus larger look-back journalism, if you will. But we need every daily journalist to do, to have some integrity and tell the story as best they can today, so that when you look back, you have all that to draw from and put in perspective. We got to work with each other. It's not this or that, it's both of them.
That's right. And I think that's something else that I didn't really appreciate as a young journalist. I always felt like you can't show your work to anybody because you might, competition might find out what you're doing, and I've overcome that fear. And for me to take on a biography of Martin Luther King, I'm going to need help. And that's the first thing I did, is I reached out to all these black scholars and all these people who knew King, and I said, if I do this, I realize, I've got some huge mountains to overcome. Will you help me? And they're not just checking for facts, they're checking for hey, you don't really understand this, or have you thought about the fact that you're mostly talking about the men in this chapter and the women aren't getting enough attention, right? All kinds of, you just want to be challenged as much as possible. I'll tell you a good story about that. So, first chapter of the book, I originally wrote the scene where Martin Luther King Sr. is going into town with his father, Jim King, to sell cotton in Stockbridge, Georgia, and they get ripped off by the white man who owns their land, and King's father, Martin Luther King Sr., gets beat up by his dad for giving some lip to the landowner, and it was a pretty good scene. I thought a reasonably good way to start the book, and I shared it with Lewis Baldwin, this theologian, and he said, I started a chapter in one of my books with that same scene. It's a good scene, and I've always regretted, this is Lewis Baldwin saying, I always regretted that I didn't think to focus more on King's grandmother instead of his grandfather. Because think about it. Jim King turns to violence, turns to alcohol, gives up his faith in God, but Delia King remains faithful, remains a believer, and I think she's the more important spiritual ancestor to Martin Luther King. Maybe you could find a way to begin your book with her instead of her husband. And as soon as he said it, I thought, you are so right. Like, that's the way to go. And I ended up finding this story that Daddy King told, Martin Luther King Sr. told about his mother beating up this white mill owner. And that's what I began the book with instead.
I loved it, by the way.
It was, and I would not have thought of that in a million years if I hadn't shared my chapters and asked for criticism.
Speaking to that point of, I thank you for mentioning the brother who's pointing out how little attention you gave women in whatever chapters you're talking about, because it was the women on our team, Dana, Sarah Geis, Irissa Apantaku, they, pointed out to me, we created a mood board, no women in it. It was a very masculine story, but yet there were some incredible women with voice in the podcast that wouldn't have been there had I not had the blessing and luxury of having these brilliant women on the team. So yeah, teamwork, it really makes the scheme work. Mm-hmm. That just speaks to how important it is for folks just to fucking work together.
Yeah.
This is what America conditions us to do, bro. Mm-hmm. America conditions us to hold shit to our chest. It was so competitive. I can't let you in because you might take from me. So my hands are always clenched.
Yeah.
That's an important lesson for just everybody in this place to learn, no matter what they do. This idea, this me, I, individualist shit is not it, bro.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We really, African proverb, we move fast alone, far together. You know what I mean? It really does take a village. I mean, this audio team at the Invisible Institute, these are some of the most incredible journalists I've met in my life, man. When we won the Pulitzer, that was wild, man. So our executive director, Andrew Fan, he sends around an email like, everybody, we should come and watch the announcements. I'm like, nah. You know what I mean? Because it's like, what's the odds we win? Then he calls me. He was like, yeah, I got your email. I don't know if I'm not sure you heard me. I got a call from New York. I just really think it would be a really good idea for you to be here. And so the rest of the team is getting this same note. So we're like, all right, let's go. So I'm going in kind of prepared to be, feel the disappointment I was trying to avoid by seeing somebody else win our category. I wouldn't look at the screen. And the screen showed the artwork before you could actually hear the mention. So I'm looking down and the whole room erupts seconds before I hear it. And I can't describe the feeling. It was disbelief and joy and pride and humbling and redemptive and life-changing, man. And that's a moment I will never fucking forget.
I don't have a team. I was sitting home alone on the couch, and Michael Eric Dyson, who's become a buddy, had been saying like for a year, you're going to win the Pulitzer. He was saying it in public. He was saying it like on stage. We did a couple of events together. He's saying, watch out, this guy's going to win a Pulitzer Prize. So he calls me, he says, when are they announcing the Pulitzers? I said, it's tomorrow. He said, call me when you win. I said, shut up. What are the odds that I'm going to win a Pulitzer? But he and a couple other people were like, put it in my head. So I figured I watched the live stream. Like, I'll watch it on YouTube and try not to get my hopes up too much just because Dyson has been bugging me all year. David Garrow, too, actually called me the day before, and he won the Pulitzer for a King book years ago. He said, I think you're the favorite. I was like, shut up. So I'm home alone on the couch watching on my laptop, and they called my name, and I just started screaming. I literally jumped off the couch screaming, where's everybody? My wife, I didn't know where she was. My kids were in school, so I just started texting people, and then my phone started ringing. But I've been a journalist since I was 16 years old, and the Pulitzer is a Pulitzer. It's the biggest thing. I called my parents. I was in tears. It was beyond anything. It was felt better than I ever could have imagined. It still does. Every day, that really happened. Just
pictured what you just said, and just picturing this guy with all of this work and everything you've done, sitting in your place alone, watching on a laptop that's a story, bro. That's a scene. That is a fucking scene, man. Congratulations,
Thanks.
man.
Well, you too.
Right on, man. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Pulitzer on the Road. Thank you to our guests, Yohance Lacour and Jonathan Eig. Yohance's 2024 Pulitzer-winning podcast is called You Didn't See Nothin. and Jonathan's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography is called King: A Life. For more details about this work and the work of all Pulitzer winners, please visit our website at www.pulitzer.org. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you get your podcasts. Pulitzer on the Road is a production of the Pulitzer Prize Board and is produced by Odyssey's Pineapple Street Studios. This show is hosted by me, Nicole Carroll. Our senior producer is Justine Dahm. Natalie Peart is our associate producer. Our executive editor is Joel Lovell. Our editor for this episode is Josh Gwynn. The head of sound and engineering at Pineapple Street is Raj Makija. This episode was mixed by Marina Pais, with additional audio engineering by Pedro Elvira. Music licensing by APM and Epidemic Sound. Editing, promotion, and other support by Pamela Casey, Edward Clement, and Sean Murphy. Barry Finkel and Marjorie Miller are our executive producers.